The late afternoon sky hung heavy with storm clouds, a restless wind tearing through the barren trees that lined the estate's driveway. The black SUV rolled to a slow stop on the gravel, the crunch of tires against loose stones swallowed by the ominous howl of the wind. Above, the clouds churned in dark, swirling patterns, casting the world in a dim and sickly gray light. Ashwood Manor stood in solemn defiance of time and weather, its tall, gray stone walls cloaked in creeping ivy, the large windows glinting faintly like watchful, vacant eyes. The air felt heavier here, tinged with the faint scent of rain and something else, something metallic and faintly sour. It wasn't just the sight of the house that unsettled Irene. It was the feeling, as though the very ground beneath them was steeped in something ancient and unresolved. The once grand mansion exuded an air of abandonment, yet it seemed strangely alive, as if it had been waiting for them, watching their every move with a silent, unblinking gaze. The wind carried with it a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant voice trying to break free from the past. Even before setting foot inside, Irene felt it in her bones, an unshakable sense that they had disturbed something best left forgotten. Irene Howard peered out from the window, her breath catching in her throat at the sight before her. The estate was magnificent in a foreboding way, its history almost palpable in the damp, chilled air. Despite its undeniable beauty, there was something unsettling about it, something that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Beside her, her husband, John Howard, sighed with satisfaction. "Just look at it, Irene," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Isn't it everything we dreamed of?" Irene forced a smile and nodded. They had spent years building their fortune, making the right investments, expanding their influence. Buying Ashwood Manor was supposed to be a symbol of their success, a legacy for their daughter, Alice. But now, standing in its shadow, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had disturbed something best left untouched. Alice, barely 7 years old, wriggled with excitement beside her mother, her small hands pressing against the window glass. "It's so big. Can I go explore?" she asked, her voice light with anticipation. John chuckled, stepping out of the SUV and turning back to help his wife and daughter. "Of course, darling. But stay where we can see you." The driver unloaded their luggage as the family stepped through the grand doors into the foyer. Inside, the manor smelled of aged wood and faint traces of lavender, though an underlying dampness lingered. A massive chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, its crystals catching the last rays of daylight filtering through stained glass windows. Irene's unease deepened as they were greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a voice like brittle leaves. "Welcome to Ashwood Manor," she said. "The staff have prepared everything for your arrival." As she spoke, the distant sound of something heavy shifting echoed from upstairs. Irene stiffened, her gaze flickering toward the grand staircase. Mrs. Finch, however, remained impassive. "The manor is old, ma'am," the housekeeper explained. "It has a way of settling in." Irene forced another smile. Of course. That evening, as they sat for dinner in the grand dining hall, the unease in Irene's chest refused to subside. The overhead chandelier cast a dim glow against the dark wood paneling, its light refracting through the crystal prisms and creating shifting patterns on the walls. Alice ate happily, oblivious to her mother's tension, while John sipped his wine, already speaking of plans to renovate parts of the estate. It was then that Alice suddenly lifted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Mama, who's the lady upstairs?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder rather than fear. Irene froze. John looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing. "What lady, sweetheart?" Alice pointed toward the grand staircase visible from the dining hall. "I saw a lady in a black dress. She was just standing there," she said with quiet certainty. A chill ran down Irene's spine. She turned to look, but the staircase was empty. Mrs. Finch, clearing the plates, hesitated for just a moment before regaining her composure. "There's no one there, dear," Irene said gently, brushing a hand over Alice's curls. "It's probably just your imagination." Alice pouted, but didn't argue. Still, Irene couldn't help the prickle of unease that crept up her neck. That night, as she lay in bed beside John, the manor remained eerily silent. Too silent. No distant city sounds, no voices of passing neighbors. Only the oppressive quiet of the vast, empty halls. Then, just as she began to drift into sleep, a noise shattered the stillness. A slow, deliberate thump echoed from the hallway outside their room. Irene's eyes snapped open. She held her breath, listening. Another thump, followed by the faintest whisper of fabric brushing against the wooden floors. Heart pounding, she reached for John's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He stirred groggily. "What?" Before she could answer, a third thump came, closer this time. Like footsteps, Irene sat up, her pulse roaring in her ears. The air felt thick, pressing against her skin. She was just about to wake John fully when the noise stopped. The silence stretched on, unbroken. Maybe it was just the house settling, just as Mrs. Finch had said. Maybe she was being foolish. And yet, as she finally lay back down, a sense of dread curled in her stomach. Something wasn't right with Ashwood Manor. The next morning, Irene awoke with a dull ache behind her eyes, the remnants of a restless night spent tossing and turning. She glanced at the alarm clock on the nightstand, 6:42 a.m. John was still fast asleep beside her, his breaths deep and even, unbothered by the disturbances of the night before. Irene pushed the covers aside and rose quietly, padding toward the window. The sky outside was a muted blue, the early morning mist clinging to the trees like ghostly fingers. Ashwood Manor stood silent, its towering presence exuding the same eerie stillness as the night before. She shivered despite the warmth of her robe. Down the hall, Alice's door was ajar. Irene frowned and pushed it open further, peering inside. Her daughter lay curled beneath the blankets, her small frame still. For a moment, relief washed over Irene, until she noticed Alice's fingers twitching against the fabric, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Alice," Irene whispered, stepping forward. Alice let out a sharp, strangled cry, her body jerking awake as if she had been startled from a nightmare. Her wide eyes darted around the dimly lit room before settling on her mother. "You were talking in your sleep," Irene murmured, kneeling beside the bed. Alice wiped at her damp forehead with the back of her hand. "I had a bad dream." Irene smoothed Alice's hair back, trying to soothe her. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Alice hesitated before whispering. "She was in my room." A cold unease gripped Irene. "Who, sweetheart?" "The lady from the stairs." Irene's fingers stiffened in Alice's hair. "What do you mean?" Alice blinked, her expression clouded with sleep. "She was standing by my bed. She whispered something, but I didn't understand the words." Irene forced herself to stay calm. "It was just a dream, my love," she said gently. "Nothing more." Alice nodded, though her gaze remained uncertain. Irene tucked the blanket snugly around her daughter. "Try to get some more sleep, all right? I'll be just down the hall." She kissed Alice's forehead and left the room, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. But as she walked back to her own bedroom, a deep sense of unease lingered. She had locked all the doors the night before. Later that day, as the sun cast weak beams of light through the manor's aged windows, Irene busied herself unpacking while John met with contractors about potential renovations. The house was livable, but some areas showed clear signs of neglect. Peeling wallpaper, warped wooden floors, a pervasive dampness in the air that no amount of fresh flowers could cover. She was standing in the hallway, adjusting an old painting, when the first note of piano music drifted through the corridors. The sound was distant but unmistakable, a haunting, melancholic melody that sent a shiver down her spine. Irene turned sharply, her heart pounding. The piano was in the main sitting room, and as far as she knew, no one was there. She made her way down the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she reached the sitting room, the melody ceased abruptly, leaving only the echo of the final note lingering in the air. The room was empty. The grand piano sat undisturbed, its glossy surface reflecting the afternoon light. Irene hesitated before stepping closer, her fingers trailing along the cool ivory keys. A sound, so soft it was almost imperceptible, drifted from behind her. She spun around, her pulse hammering in her throat. Mrs. Finch stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Is something the matter, ma'am?" Irene exhaled slowly, forcing herself to relax. "I thought I heard music." Mrs. Finch's lips twitched, though it was not quite a smile. "The house has its ways," she said simply before turning to leave. Irene remained frozen for a long moment before finally stepping away from the piano, the unease in her chest growing heavier. That evening, as Irene set about preparing Alice for bed, she noticed her daughter seemed paler than usual. The child's usual energy had dimmed, her movements slower, her eyes shadowed. "Are you feeling all right?" Irene asked, pressing a hand to Alice's forehead. "No fever, but something wasn't right." Alice hesitated. "I feel tired, Mama. And my chest, it feels heavy." A strange chill passed through Irene. She kissed Alice's forehead, tucking the blankets around her once more. "Get some rest, sweetheart. I'll check on you later." That night, as she lay in bed once more, the silence stretched on. And then, just as she began to drift into sleep, the distant sound of piano keys being played, slow, deliberate, filled the darkened halls of Ashwood Manor. This time, it did not stop. The following morning, Irene awoke with a start, the remnants of a restless sleep clinging to her like a heavy fog. She wasn't sure what had startled her awake, but an unsettling sense of being watched lingered in the air. John was already up, his side of the bed cold, the faint sound of his voice echoing from downstairs. She stretched and rose from the bed, slipping in her robe before heading down the hall to check on Alice. Pushing the door open gently, she found her daughter still asleep, her small chest rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. Irene frowned. Alice had been sluggish the night before, and now, even in sleep, there was a pallor to her skin that made Irene's stomach twist. She brushed her hand over Alice's forehead. No fever, but her skin felt unnaturally cool. "Sweetheart?" Irene whispered. Alice stirred slightly, but did not wake. As she straightened, Irene felt a shift in the air. The room had grown noticeably colder, the sunlight streaming through the window, doing little to push away the unnatural chill. A draft, perhaps? She glanced around, noting that the windows were shut tight. She pulled Alice's blanket up higher and quietly stepped out, making her way down the stairs to find John. John was in the study, speaking with a contractor about structural concerns. As Irene entered, he looked up, smiling. "Morning, darling. Sleep any better?" She hesitated before answering. "Not really." John chuckled lightly, mistaking her concern for humor. "You'll get used to it. Old houses have a way of feeling different." Irene forced a nod, but a voice in her head whispered, "Not different." "Wrong." The contractor, a man in his early 50s named Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat. "There's something interesting about this place," he said, flipping through some papers. "The foundation's been modified over the years, but originally, it seems there was an old well beneath the east wing." "A well?" Irene repeated. Mr. Calloway nodded. "Long since covered, of course, but it's an unusual feature to have beneath a house like this." A strange unease settled in Irene's stomach. Why would anyone build over a well? Calloway shrugged. Could have been for convenience, or maybe there was some reason they wanted it out of sight. His words sent a shiver up her spine. Out of sight. That afternoon, Irene wandered the east wing of the manor, running her fingers over the aged wallpaper as she moved. There was something about this part of the house, something off. The hallways felt narrower, the light dimmer, and the air was thick with a musty scent, as if time itself had stalled here. A faint whisper reached her ears. She froze, her heart leaping to her throat. The sound had been soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She turned slowly, her breath catching. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Yet, the whisper came again, this time clearer, threading through the still air like a sigh. Help! Irene took a step back, her pulse hammering. It was then that she noticed something strange about the farthest section of the wall. The wallpaper was slightly different, the pattern misaligned. Tentatively, she reached out and pressed her palm against it. The surface felt hollow. A hidden door? She swallowed hard, stepping away as a chill curled around her spine. She would need to tell John. But as she turned, the whispering stopped. The hallway fell into silence. Too much silence. And then, from deep within the walls, something knocked. Once. Twice. Irene fled. That night, she sat beside Alice's bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her daughter's chest. The child had barely eaten that evening. Her usual spark dimmed further. Every instinct in Irene's body screamed that something was wrong. She reached out and smoothed Alice's hair back when she heard it again, the whisper. Soft, almost tender. Not her. Irene's breath hitched. The voice had come from behind her. Spinning around, she found the room empty. The shadows clung to the corners, unmoving, and the faint moonlight did little to ease her growing dread. She wasn't imagining it. Something was in this house. Something was watching them, and it wanted something from them. Something she feared she was only beginning to understand. The next day, Irene made up her mind. She had to investigate further. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and determination, she returned to the east wing, her heart thudding with each step. The wallpaper still appeared slightly misaligned, and the memory of the knocking behind the walls made her hands tremble. Taking a deep breath, she pressed firmly against the hollow section. The wall shifted beneath her touch. With a groan, a narrow panel slid open, revealing a passageway beyond. Dust and stale air billowed out, making her cough as she hesitantly stepped inside. The corridor was barely wide enough for her to pass through, its walls lined with rotting wood. She moved carefully, shining the light ahead, illuminating a set of stairs leading downward. The deeper she ventured, the more oppressive the air became, thick with a scent that turned her stomach. Damp earth and something else, something rotten. At the bottom of the stairs, she found a small, enclosed space. An old wooden chair sat in the center, bound in rusty chains. Dark stains marred the floor beneath it. Along the walls, crude carvings had been etched into the stone. Words she didn't recognize, symbols that sent an involuntary shudder through her body. A faint breath of air stirred behind her. Irene spun around, flashlight trembling in her grip. For a fraction of a second, she saw a figure standing in the passageway, tall, shrouded in darkness, its face obscured. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. A chilling whisper slithered through the air. "You shouldn't be here." Irene turned and ran, the sound of footsteps chasing her up the stairs, her breath ragged with terror. She burst into the hallway, shoving the hidden door shut behind her, pressing her weight against it as if expecting something, someone, to force it open from the other side. But nothing happened. Silence returned. Yet she knew, without a doubt, that whatever lurked beneath Ashwood Manor had seen her. And now, it knew she had seen it too. Irene sat in the dimly lit study, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She had barely spoken since returning from the hidden passage, her thoughts tangled in the unsettling discovery beneath the house. The old chair, the rusted chains, the symbols. Every detail gnawed at her like a festering wound. She had spent the better part of an hour convincing herself that it was some relic of a bygone era, a storage space abandoned and forgotten. But she knew better. Someone had been there, and it had seen her. John entered the room, his expression drawn. "Irene, you've barely touched your food?" She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something." John sighed, sitting beside her. "The manor is full of secrets. That's what happens with houses this old." "No," Irene shook her head. "This is different. There's a hidden passage in the east wing." I went inside. John's brow furrowed. "What?" "There's a staircase leading underground. A room with a chair. Chains. Symbols on the walls." She hesitated, swallowing against the unease rising in her throat. "John, someone suffered down there." His jaw tightened. "This is absurd. Maybe it was just some old storage room." "I heard something," she interrupted. "Something whispered to me. And I saw someone." John ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "Irene, you're exhausted. You haven't been sleeping in this house." "I know what I saw." Her voice trembled with certainty. "And Alice, she's getting worse." John stiffened. The truth in her words was undeniable. Alice had grown weaker over the past few days. Her once vibrant energy dulled to near lethargy. The doctors had found nothing wrong with her, but Irene knew better. Something in this house was draining her daughter's life away. A knock at the study door startled them both. Mrs. Finch stood there, her usual stoic demeanor unreadable. "Forgive me for interrupting, sir, ma'am, but there is someone here to see you." Her voice wavered slightly, an unusual crack in her typically composed tone. "She's an old friend of mine, someone I thought could help. I couldn't stand seeing Miss Alice this way. Please don't be angry with me, ma'am." Mrs. Finch stepped aside, revealing a tall, older woman standing in the hallway. Her skin was deep brown, her silver-streaked hair pulled back tightly. She wore a long, dark coat, her gaze steady and knowing. "I am Matilda Grey," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I have come for the child." Mrs. Finch reached out to me because she feared for Alice's life. She has known of my abilities for years, my connection to the spirits, my work as a medium. She came to me in desperation, knowing that I have dealt with such hauntings before. When she saw the child's worsening condition and the doctors had no answers, she felt she had no choice but to turn to me, hoping that if the physical world could not save Alice, perhaps the spiritual one could. When she saw the child's worsening condition, she could not stand by and do nothing. She told me everything, hoping that if the doctors could not help, perhaps I could. That is why I am here." John frowned. "At this hour?" Matilda entered the room with a quiet grace, her presence commanding yet unassuming. She was not just an ordinary woman. She was a practiced spiritualist and medium, someone who had spent her life confronting the unseen. She had encountered cases like this before. Houses steeped in old blood, spirits trapped in an endless cycle of vengeance. This was not the first time she had stepped between the living and the dead, but something about Ashwood Manor felt different, more personal, more wrathful. Known in certain circles for her uncanny ability to communicate with the departed, she had come at the request of Mrs. Finch, who trusted her implicitly. Matilda's gaze swept across the grand, yet foreboding space, taking in the high ceilings, the dim flicker of the chandelier, and the ancient furniture that seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. She took in the high ceilings, the dim flicker of the chandelier, the ancient furniture that seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. She also noticed the subtle signs, drafts where there should be none, the lingering chill of unseen presences, the heavy, watchful silence that suggested they were not alone. Finally, her eyes settled on Irene. "You've seen them, haven't you?" Irene swallowed. "Seen what?" Matilda took another step closer. "The ones who whisper. The ones who do not rest." John scoffed. "This is ridiculous. I think you should leave." Matilda ignored him, her expression unwavering. "Your daughter is connected to this place. The spirits know who she is. That is why she is suffering." Irene clenched her hands, the fear rising in her throat. Why? Matilda exhaled deeply. Because this house remembers. And so do they. John rubbed his temples, pacing. Let me guess. You think this house is haunted? That ghosts are harming my daughter. Matilda's gaze did not waver. I do not think. I know. Upstairs, Alice's bedroom door creaked open as Irene led Matilda inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted. The heavy curtains shifted, though there was no breeze. A faint shadow flickered in the corner of the room, a presence lingering just beyond sight. Matilda walked to Alice's bedside and knelt, placing a gentle hand on the child's forehead. She murmured something under her breath, words Irene didn't recognize, and almost instantly Alice stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy and distant. It hurts, she whispered. Irene reached for her hand, but Matilda stopped her. Do not touch her. Not yet. Irene's heart pounded. What's happening to her? Matilda's eyes darkened. She is caught between the living and the dead. A soft creak echoed from the far corner of the room. Irene turned just in time to see the shadows shift, like something had moved within them. Matilda straightened, her face grim. They are watching. A sharp, chilling whisper slithered through the room, carrying a message Irene could finally understand. She must pay. The air became heavier, pressing down on her chest. Irene gripped the bedpost, forcing herself to stay upright. Who must pay? Matilda's voice was barely above a whisper. Your family's sins are not forgotten. John's voice cut through the tension as he entered the room. What the hell is going on? Matilda fixed her gaze on him, her voice cold. This manor was built on secrets. Your ancestor, the one who first claimed this land, saw power and opportunity in owning lives. He forced himself upon one of the women he enslaved, and when she bore his child, the scandal was undeniable. His wife discovered the truth and, desperate to protect the family's reputation and the standing of her powerful lineage, demanded the situation be erased. She ordered her husband to silence the woman and her child forever. They were taken to the basement, bound to that chair you found, and killed without mercy. Their bodies were buried beneath this house, and the truth was hidden. When the guilt and fear became too great, your ancestors abandoned the manor, erased its existence from family history, and hoped the world would forget. But the spirits never forgot, and neither did the house. Irene's breath hitched. But why us? Why now? Matilda turned her gaze to Alice. Because you returned. The house called to you, and the spirits, the ones who suffered, saw their chance. For generations, your family buried the truth, hiding this property, erasing its existence from records. Your great-grandfather, unable to face his wife's powerful family and the scandal of his crimes, killed those he enslaved and buried them beneath this house. He fled under the guise of starting anew, leaving behind only silence and lies. They thought they could escape justice by abandoning it. John's face paled. We didn't know. We didn't. Matilda's voice rose, sharp and unyielding. But now you do, and they will not stop until the truth is laid bare. Before anyone could answer, Alice suddenly gasped, her back arching as she let out a strangled cry. A cold wind surged through the room, knocking over the bedside lamp and plunging them in a flickering darkness. Irene reached for her daughter, but Matilda pulled her back. She is not alone. Alice's eyes opened again, but they were not her own. A deep, endless blackness swallowed her irises, her lips parting to release a single word in a voice that was not her own. Retribution. The room erupted in chaos as the walls trembled, the very foundation of Ashwood Manor shaking beneath them. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in anger, sorrow, and vengeance. Pictures fell from the walls, the bed shook violently, and the air filled with the scent of decay. Irene clutched John's arm. We have to stop this, she shouted over the commotion. Matilda's gaze remained fixed on Alice. There is only one way. You must listen. You must understand. Alice's body stiffened, and then, slowly, her lips moved again. Her voice, now layered with many, spoke words neither of them expected. We remember. We suffered. We demand justice. Irene felt the weight of history crash upon her, the undeniable truth of what had been buried beneath their home. This was not just a haunting. This was a reckoning, and they were running out of time. The room was suffocating. The walls trembled as unseen forces swirled around them, the whispers overlapping, weaving into a chorus of the forgotten. Irene clung to John's arm, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the darkness deepened around Alice. The child sat upright now, though her body was eerily rigid, her eyes black voids that seemed to see beyond the living world. Matilda remained still, her presence like a lone, unwavering flame against the growing storm of vengeance. "What do you want?" Irene's voice wavered, barely cutting through the discordant murmurs filling the air. Alice, or whatever force had taken hold of her, tilted her head, those inhuman eyes locking onto her mother. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations, an echo of pain and rage. The blood must be acknowledged. The sins must be unearthed. Irene felt her knees weaken. "What sins? What are you talking about?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Matilda took a slow step forward, her gaze unwavering. "They seek justice for what was taken." John, who had been silent until now, exhaled sharply, his frustration spilling over. "This is insane. You're all talking in riddles while my daughter—" Alice's head snapped in his direction, and the voices ceased in an instant. The sudden silence was deafening. Then she spoke again. "Your bloodline, bathed in betrayal, lies built these walls. Beneath them, the truth rots. Unearth it, or it will consume you." A powerful gust of wind burst through the room, knocking over furniture and sending books flying from their shelves. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, pressing down on Irene like unseen hands forcing her to the floor. She gasped, struggling for breath, the weight of the spirits closing in. Matilda, despite the chaos, remained unmoving. "They are bound to this house," she said calmly. "And so are you, until the truth is faced." John clenched his fists. "I don't know what you expect us to do." Matilda's eyes darkened. "Dig?" The word sent a cold shiver through Irene's spine. She remembered what the contractor had said. The well, buried beneath the east wing, out of sight, forgotten. She turned to John, dread settling in her bones. "We have to go to the basement." Armed with lanterns and an old shovel, John and Irene descended into the depths of Ashwood Manor, Matilda following closely behind. The basement was damp, the scent of old earth and mildew filling their lungs. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the stone walls as their lanterns flickered, casting eerie shapes that seemed to move with them. Irene's pulse quickened as they reached the farthest corner of the basement. The floor was uneven, the dirt appearing disturbed in places, as though something had once been buried but had since tried to rise again. Matilda stopped and knelt, running her fingers over the soil. "This is where they rest, and this is where the truth must be revealed." John swallowed hard. This is madness. But Irene had already grasped the shovel, her knuckles white. "Then let's end it." She drove the blade into the dirt. The first few strikes were met with resistance, but soon the soil gave way. As they dug, the whispers above seemed to quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then the shovel hit something solid. Irene hesitated, then knelt, brushing dirt away with trembling hands. Her fingers grazed something cold and smooth. Bone! A gasp left her lips as more of the remains were uncovered. Skulls fractured and forgotten. Shackles rusted and broken. And among them, a single, tattered cloth, the remnants of a dress long since faded. Matilda exhaled, closing her eyes as though mourning what had been lost. "Now you see." Irene stared in horror, tears welling in her eyes. What happened here? Matilda's voice was soft, but laced with sorrow. Your ancestor was not merely a landowner. He was a master. And these, she gestured toward the remains, were his secrets. Irene shook her head, her mind racing. No, this can't be. John stepped back, his face pale. This isn't possible. We would have known. Matilda turned to him, her gaze heavy. That is why they buried it. Because they knew that truth would destroy them. A new sound filled the air. A low, keening wail that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the house. Irene felt it vibrating in her chest, a sorrow so vast it threatened to consume her. Alice's voice rang out, disembodied but clear. Do you hear them now? The shadows trembled. The house groaned. And in that moment, Irene knew this was only the beginning. As the wailing intensified, the lanterns flickered violently. The air became so thick with an unseen force that it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Irene clutched John's arm tighter, her body rigid with fear. Above them, in the house, footsteps pounded across the floor, many, many footsteps, moving in erratic patterns as if an entire unseen crowd had awoken. Matilda knelt by the exposed remains, pressing her hand against the earth. She closed her eyes and began to chant, her voice strong and unwavering. We see you. We hear you. The blood that was spilled shall not be forgotten. The temperature plummeted. The walls groaned under an invisible pressure. The bones beneath them shifted, dust rising into the air as if disturbed by unseen hands. Irene held her breath as Alice's voice joined Matilda's chant. Except it was no longer just Alice. It was them, hundreds of voices, layered over each other, mourning, crying, demanding justice. He took our lives. He took our names. He buried us beneath his house so the world would forget. But we remember. Irene's body trembled. What do they want from us? She gasped, barely able to hold herself up. Matilda opened her eyes, staring at her with an intensity that sent ice through Irene's veins. They want the house to fall. They want the sins to be exposed. And they want retribution. A deep, splintering crack echoed through the basement as the floor began to tremble. The foundation was giving way. The spirits were done waiting. John grabbed Irene's hand, panic in his eyes. We have to get out. But Alice, still possessed by forces beyond their comprehension, turned her head toward her mother. A deep, inhuman voice rumbled from her small frame. You must make a choice. End the cycle, or be buried with it. The ground beneath them lurched, dust and debris raining down from above. Irene looked at the remains, at Matilda, at Alice. And then she made her decision. Irene's breath came in sharp gasps as the basement walls trembled around her. Dust and debris cascaded from the ceiling, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The ground beneath them lurched violently, as if the very house itself were coming alive, desperate to expel its sins. Alice, or rather the force that had overtaken her, remained seated in eerie stillness, her darkened eyes locked onto Irene. The echoes of countless voices vibrated through the room, their demands undeniable. In the cycle, unearth the truth, or perish beneath its weight. John's grip on her arm tightened. Irene, we have to go. Now! But Irene could barely hear him over the voices, the rising wails of suffering that filled the space. The decision pressed against her chest like a crushing weight. If they ran now, they would never escape the reach of this place. The spirits would follow. And Alice would never be free. Matilda's voice rose above the chaos, firm and unyielding. You cannot run from this, Irene. The blood of the past demands justice. The truth must be spoken. Irene looked to Matilda, then back at the pile of bones half buried in the earth. It was more than just a secret. It was a crime, a betrayal that had spanned generations, waiting, festering, demanding recognition. She staggered forward, falling to her knees before the remains. "I see you," she choked out, her hands trembling as she touched the earth. "I hear you." A shudder rippled through the basement. The whispers surged, then quieted, as though the voices had paused, listening. Irene swallowed her fear and forced herself to continue. "My family, my ancestor did this to you. He took your lives. He buried your truth. But I will not. Not anymore." The wailing turned into a low hum, surrounding them in vibrating energy. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Matilda stepped beside her, kneeling. "Names have power. Speak them if you know them." Irene's mind raced. She didn't know their names, but something deep within her, something buried in the history of this place, whispered to her. She closed her eyes and let the words come. Amara, Tobias, Lillian, Ruth. The names tumbled from her lips, unbidden yet familiar, like echoes from another lifetime. "You are not forgotten." A sharp crack split the air. The very foundation beneath them shuddered as though exhaling. The howling wind that had threatened to consume them stilled. The oppressive energy that had pressed against Irene's chest lightened, and for the first time since they had arrived, she felt as though she could truly breathe. Alice gasped and collapsed, her body limp. Irene rushed to her, gathering her daughter into her arms. Her skin was warm now, her breathing deep and steady. The black void in her eyes had vanished, leaving behind the soft blue that Irene knew so well. John dropped to his knees beside them. "Alice? Alice, sweetheart." Her eyelids fluttered, then opened fully. "Daddy." Her voice was hoarse, confused. Irene let out a sob of relief, clutching her daughter against her. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Matilda stood, dusting off her coat. "It is done." Irene looked up at her, tears streaking her face. "Is it over?" Matilda tilted her head slightly, listening. The air had settled. The walls no longer groaned. Even the distant sound of footsteps that had plagued them since the first night was gone. "It is over," Matilda confirmed. "They have been heard, and they have been released." The next morning, Irene and John packed their bags. Alice, though weak, was feeling better, her color slowly returning. The house, once suffocating, now stood in an eerie silence, no longer tormented, but emptied. "Hello." Matilda stood by the front door as they prepared to leave. "You have done what was necessary," she said to Irene. "But you must still make a choice." Irene frowned. "A choice?" Matilda nodded toward the house. "You can leave it standing, let it exist as a monument to the past, or you can tear it down, ensuring no one else will ever suffer from its legacy." John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This place should be demolished." Irene, however, wasn't so sure. It wasn't the house that had been evil. It was the history buried within it. And now that history had been revealed, "What do you want to do?" John asked her softly. Irene turned back, staring at the great looming structure of Ashwood Manor. The wind stirred around them, but there was no malice in it anymore. Only quiet. She made her choice. Weeks later, as they settled into a new home far away from Ashwood, Irene received a letter. No return address. Just an old, yellowed envelope with a single sheet inside. A list of names. The names she had spoken that night. And at the bottom, a final message, written in a hand that did not belong to her. "We remember. And now, so do you." The weeks passed in a blur. Yet Irene found herself returning to Ashwood Manor in her thoughts more often than she liked. Even now, in the warmth of their new home, where the past could not reach them, she could still feel the weight of what had transpired. The truth of her family's history lingered in her bones, a burden that would not simply disappear. She sat in the quiet of their new study, the letter resting in front of her. The list of names, the message left behind. "We remember. And now, so do you." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but she knew. The spirits had found peace, yet their story was now hers to bear. John entered the room, carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her, then leaned against the desk. "You've been staring at that letter for hours." Irene exhaled softly, fingers tracing the old, yellowed paper. "It doesn't feel over." John rubbed his face, exhausted but resolute. "It is. We got out. Alice is safe. The house is gone." She met his gaze. "Is it? Or did we just run from it?" John hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Irene closed her eyes, listening to the quiet hum of life around them. Alice playing in the yard, birds chirping outside. There was peace here, but inside, the story still called to her. "I want people to know the truth," she finally said. "About what happened. About them." John sighed, but nodded. "Then we tell it. Whatever it takes." Months later, Irene sat across from a journalist in a small cafe, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. The woman, a well-respected historian named Evelyn Carter, had listened in stunned silence as Irene recounted the horrors of Ashwood Manor. "This is incredible," Evelyn whispered. "If we can verify any of this, it will change everything we thought we knew about that estate." Irene nodded. "I don't need people to believe in ghosts, but they need to believe in what happened. Those lives were real. Their suffering was real." Evelyn leaned forward. "Are you ready for the backlash? The scrutiny?" Irene thought of Alice, safe in their new home, of Matilda's knowing gaze, of the whispers that had once haunted her nights. "I am," she said. As Evelyn began taking notes, the air around them seemed to shift, lighter, less burdened. The story was no longer hidden in the dark. It was coming into the light, where it belonged. For the first time since leaving Ashwood Manor, Irene felt free. That night, as she lay in bed, she dreamt of the manor one last time. But this time, it wasn't decaying. The walls stood tall, the windows open to the sun, and in the distance, shadows faded into the light. Their whispers no longer cries for vengeance, but murmurs of gratitude. She had listened, and they had finally been heard.